Dr. Ravitch is a professor of practice at Penn GSE. Her areas of expertise include sustainable leadership and organization change and professional development. She holds degrees in human development and psychology and risk and prevention and has experience working as a counselor as well. Sharon, how are you holding up during this quarantine?
I'm holding up okay. And one of the things that I had mentioned to you earlier was that having counseling skills in this moment feels like a privilege and something that really can help me think about the ways that people are trying to do what they do right now um, with a sense of clarity, presence, and calm.
Right. So the topic of this session is rhythms and boundary setting. Can you tell us why you chose that title? Why rhythms and boundaries?
Absolutely. So, a focus on boundaries without rhythms to me can often take a negative valence. And I think actually in this moment, we can think about boundaries really positively. I think about Fred Erickson, who was my advisor at Penn GSE many, many moons ago, who talks about the ways that we can create boundaries or borders, right? And boundaries in that conceptualization are a positive thing. There are ways that the naturally occurring differences and distances between any two people can be mutually respected. And
Mm.
so I think about boundaries in a positive sense. And so I think that's one important note. And then the rhythms around the boundaries. So our routines and our identities and our mental health are all in flow at the same time. And from my perspective, if we can think about setting boundaries in a broader rhythm of our lives right now, it's a more mindful approach that's not only efficient, but then also can be relational.
Wonderful. And that's a really important reminder that boundaries have a positive connotation as well. It's not just about stopping ourselves from doing things, it's about creating new patterns for ourselves.
Exactly. And just in relation to that, that those can, and I would argue should be co-created, those boundaries. And
Mhm.
so one of the things I know that we're going to talk about this, I'll put it in right now. A lot of us are thinking and feeling that things that the people in our homes around us right now are doing might be distracting to our work, or they're not respecting what we need. And what I'm trying to talk to folks about, particularly people with children, but actually anyone with anyone else in the house, is about really thinking about, have you sat down to reset the rhythms of your lives? And so to me, one really important thing that people can think about is that how do we, whomever I am with right now during this time of needing to be social distancing, how can we use this as a way to think about what everyone needs, to reintroduce ourselves as a family to each other in terms of our rhythms, boundaries, or maybe not family, collective, whomever might be in your house, and to really think together about how do we reset a new set of norms? How do we co-construct that new set of norms, taking into account a range of needs, even when they might be conflicting? And
Right.
so I would urge anyone listening, if you have other folks in your home, whoever they are, to actually sit down and have an explicit conversation, a loving, explicit conversation where everyone's listening, taking in. And I would even do a little summary at the end, like, okay, so what we're hearing about each other are the following things. I would commit that to writing. You can make it a fun chart or graphic on the wall. I texted something to my teenagers that we came up with together so that we all have it. And it's actually a way to create, again, positive relational co-construction of what's going on in your home right now, particularly as it relates to doing work and what we all might need. Um,
Right.
the kinds of space, different kinds of space that we need now than we may have needed before for different kinds of durations.
Right.
That's invisible to our kids, for example. It might also be invisible to partners
Mm.
or parents who are living with you. And so really thinking about the other person's perspective of, do they even realize how things have changed for you? What would it mean? What would it look like to share that with each other in a way that's really growth and support oriented?
Right. And I think you're touching on a really important point, which is, there are different types of boundaries. So, what I hear you talking about is boundaries between ourselves and the people around us, be it our families, be it our roommates, whoever we're closest to right now. And so, just to summarize what I heard you say, one specific strategy that we can use to establish those boundaries is really having explicit conversations and making our invisible needs visible to the people around us.
Much better said. I like that version better. Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. And making sure we're doing the work of listening to them, right? That it's not just us sharing that out. It has to be reciprocal and collective.
Right. And so, in addition to having explicit conversations around these boundaries, are there other sorts of strategies that you would recommend to help that people can use to help communicate our boundaries and our needs?
That's a
Um,
great, great question. One of the things I've shared with a number of my graduate students who have small children is, you know, color coded, whatever they are, pieces of paper, index cards on your door, right? Red or green, and explaining what that means. If it's red, it's really an urgent, and also being judicious about when we use those colors also, right? But so that right now, let's say I actually have a red Post-it note on my door so that both of my sons know this is really serious time. You know, definitely don't call me to make you a burrito. Um,
right.
so that kind of thing. And so I do think some of those physical, they know if I'm upstairs in my room during the workday, that means it's a video conference versus being in the library or in the living room with them, also because I've communicated that.
Right, right. So that's really helpful for establishing boundaries with others. There are also boundaries that we
Yeah.
have with ourselves and within ourselves. Can you speak to what that looks like? How do we set boundaries with and for ourselves?
Absolutely. And in full disclosure, I've done a lot of this before this moment in the world. And so and because we've worked so closely together, I know you knew about a lot of these things. So I actually have a lot of boundaries around my work all the time. I'm finding them particularly useful right now. And I'll just share a few of them. One is I'm very, very intentional about what I do on which time of brain functioning, meaning I've gotten very mindful and very intentional about not using my quality thinking hours for email or not using my quality thinking hours for a piece that I'm writing. I don't need to think so much. Let me do my data analysis during that time. And I actually am very boundaried about it. I don't do email for long stretches of period at a time when I'm working on things. I turn off my email notifications, all of my sounds and my badges on my texts. And so for me, there's two things I'm talking about. One is my brain functions in certain ways at certain times. The ecosystem of my house is more or less quiet and conducive. And I'm very intentional each day about what work I'm going to do when. The other piece of that is I've gotten very intentional about how I can wrap around my writing. So for me, if I'm working on two projects at one time, that's more helpful to me than working on one project because I'll spend all of my time on that one project because that's the way I get very intense about the things I'm working on. So right now I have 2 or 3 writing projects on the bottom of my computer at any one time, and I'll pick up one or the other, sometimes just in relation to how excited I am about it or how hard it is. And I'll be very intentional when I choose to do that. And one piece I want to say about that is not being judgmental about that. There are moments I either can only do email or I can't do anything, right? Anything work related, and I need to honor that too. So part of it is about understanding the way one's mind works, and the other is about giving oneself grace to understand. And there are a lot of really amazing articles on this, and if anyone, my Twitter handle is there. There's one that just came out about really the importance of honoring downtime and honoring time that is really about not being quote unquote productive, but more importantly, reframing what productive means. And in this moment of our lives, reframing what productive means is everything. If you can be loving and good and contributing to the common good and low level getting done what you need to do every day, you've been enormously successful that day. And I think more people, one of the things that's happening right now is our our forced focus on productivity in a transactional sense of that term is being redefined. I think it's a tremendous opportunity. So I think if we can harness our own brain, our own working style, our own sets of relationships in the home, we'll be better able to honor what our brain is actually capable of doing when, and doing that in a loving rather than a judgmental way.
Right. So, just to extend this metaphor of making the invisible visible, it sounds like it's just as important to make our invisible work patterns, our invisible assumptions, our invisible feelings about ourselves and our work that may be buried deep within us visible to ourselves. And that an important first step
Absolutely.
is being non judgmental and simply just being curious about what's in
That's
us right
exactly
now.
right. And in fact, as you know, being curious is my entry point to any self reflection, right? Can we be curious and not judgmental? And the way you just said that was so perfect. That's exactly right. Making our own working style, our own learning style, our own need for balance and rhythm in different ways between work and life and work in life. I think knowing that is the key to really being able to harness the power of our own minds and our own time that we have right now.
Sense. So you've spoken a lot about the benefits of setting rhythms, setting boundaries for ourselves. Can you speak a little bit to the challenges associated with these strategies?
Sure. I think some of the I mean, I think the biggest challenge is self-judgment.
Mm,
That's, I would argue that's probably one of the larger challenges of everything. I think part of it is self-judgment. I think part of it is that the world is shifting, including expectations. And so a lot of us aren't sure what's due when, and what does anything mean, and how do we recalibrate, and how long is this going to be. And so to me, I think trying to have a spaciousness around time and time for tasks, for me, I, of course, we all try to do the thing that is due soonest, but sometimes right now we don't even know where our projects are headed. And so to me, seeking clarity about things like that, like when I'm talking to students right now, a lot of time what's most helpful to them is just hearing, why don't you just ask for an extension? Or, hey, what about thinking about combining two papers and doing something a little bit different that might be a deeper dive into something and might make more sense right now. Or, I have a class, for example, in the mid-career program for educational leaders, one of our executive doctoral programs. And we've decided to actually do a collective research project on leading during COVID, and to do an edited volume out of it instead of each person was doing an individual pilot. They're still getting all the same skills out of it, and research process acumen development. But now they're able to do something that'll really move the dial on their own lives and their own leadership as educational leaders. Those kinds of creative, collaborative, collectivist things, I think, can also help us move from working so individually to thinking much more about communities of practice, writing in community, and things like
yeah.
that.
For for those of you in our audience who were able to join us yesterday, what you're speaking to really connects with what Dr. Herman was talking about in terms of revisiting purpose, right? And how rethinking what our purpose is in these moments and how it might have changed from what it was before is so important. He was talking about it on a team level, and what I hear you saying is both on a team level, but also on an individual level.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, so Sharon, one last question for you, and then we'll take some questions from the
Absolutely.
audience.
Mhm.
But for those of us who are eager to start implementing some of these boundary and rhythm setting strategies, what are our next steps?
That is a great question. What I would say is for the next day or two to really think about your own rhythms, to
Mm,
really think about how your mind works when you're able to do certain kinds of times. I would do introspection first, really try to think curiously, not judgmentally, in a loving way. You're trying to support yourself the way you would support someone you care about. I would take stock of those kinds of things. How do I think? When do I think in the most focused ways? When do I feel like I can do the most creative kinds of writing, or the most whatever it might be?
mhm,
How do I think about my courses, or whatever it might be for different people, from my perspective, take stock over the next 2 or 3 days. Move through your life very curiously about that, maybe jot down some bullet points, and then parlay that into a constructive conversation or set of conversations with the people around you. And perhaps not just the people around you, your colleagues, your peers, people whom you're collaborating with or have deliverables for. Really think about outward facing communication and reaching out to folks and making explicit. I've had students feel afraid to tell me they wanted an extension. And of course, I mean, who would ever not consider such a thing during this time? But the self-judgment got in the way of their asking. And so one of the self-assessments I would say to do is, what is my relationship to asking for or needing support? And how can I be curious about that? These are times where we all need added supports. We need supports we're not even sure what they are yet, and we need to live into that. And so curiosity and intention and kindness around our own process will enable us to then be that way with the people we love, set really clear, really loving connection and boundary kinds of norms in the house. Or apartment. And I think that's really, from my perspective, the next steps.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes remaining, so I'm going to turn to some questions from our participants. And this is actually directly building on what you were just talking about. A. Knowles asks, do you have any suggestions on how to set boundaries with your superiors? So this might not be people immediately living near us or around us, but perhaps people we're collaborating with now in online spaces.
That's a great question. And so here, I want to say a few things. First of all, context is everything. So I'm giving a broad answer to that. But I appreciate the question. And I think that it's important to say that one of the things that should be, at least, and I think is for many people coming out of this, is that we're all in this together. And that a lot of the hierarchies that seemed very meaningful before are dissolving. Now, some folks in positions of power might not see it that way, and that's a reality. But I think that one should proceed as if the humanity of your quote unquote superior is of that nature. And I would be resolute, standing in your own sense of what you need to do, but being very clear about how to advocate for yourself, and actually coming from a place of expecting humility. Because I think that, and in this moment, everyone is reassessing, I should hope, how we lead. I would also role play and perhaps practice with people you feel real safe with in your immediate circle, how to have a difficult conversation, how to write a difficult email to someone who is above you in the hierarchy. To me, that's something that I think about a lot when I do leadership development, is how do you communicate up, right? And to me, practicing that, getting comfortable with being direct and kind and clear, standing in your own power, but also understanding that the hierarchy is real. And we have to navigate that with judiciously. There's a video circulating on Twitter right now about a nurse who was told that she could not wear her protective gear by her superior in the hospital. And with love and sadness in her heart, she quit that job. And that raises a lot of things for her. But I think I raise that example to say, we do need to know where our own lines are. And if someone is asking us to do something that is truly not in the immediate, like palpable, important best interest of our well-being or the well-being of the people around us, that's something to spend some time planning for and communicating to someone who's above you.
We actually have a comment from Tara Bryant Gray, who says, love Dr. Ravitch's capacity to reflect on the here and now and reframe it as a growth opportunity. My husband is an ICU doctor, and boundary setting from the very negative and worrisome news has been essential for maintaining my family's mental and physical health right now. I feel so lucky to have had Dr. Ravitch this semester. Thank you for the simple yet beautiful reminders that productivity is very personal and relative.
Well, first of all, I feel for you, and I'm thinking about you and all of the folks on here who have someone in your home who's a medical practitioner. Right, those boundaries are really fraught. And I was actually on the phone with a doctoral student who's in a similar situation and has 3 young kids. and her husband is really on the front lines as a doctor. And one of the things we talked about is how to do these boundaries, even of taking off clothing in a mudroom before coming in or whatever it is, the physical boundaries, the emotional boundaries, and to really explicate that and to make it explicit and to be really loving about it was what we really talked about. How do they establish these very health related boundaries, but in ways that are really empathetic and take, you know, everyone's perspective in this. So thank you so much for your kind words and your generosity, and thank you for your service of supporting your family and your partner who's a medical practitioner.
We have another question from Jen, who asks, how do you practice patience within these boundaries, especially if you don't have patience? Who is
Well,
asking for a friend, I will add, not for herself.
I lack patience ever. We are all our best
Right.
selves always. Well, I think that's really important. So really, I think, you know, 1, 2, and 3 is kindness and compassion. You know, if when people struggle with the boundaries that we put out or the rhythms that we're trying to co-construct, they're obviously struggling with something within. That might not be our responsibility, but it can be a helpful opening to understanding how can we actually break through what we're all putting up right now, huge defense mechanisms. We are all in a collective moment of trauma. We are all going back to the refrains of our mental health habits on a continuum, right? Many of us have done a lot of work over the years and feel like we're able to flex different muscles of self-care and wellness. We're all on that continuum. And so my answer is help people to understand how important their own wellness is. Help people to understand what their needs are and maybe start there, not even with what you need, but helping them get in touch and be mindful with how are they feeling? What's their stress level? I do a thing with my sons where we gauge our levels of stress at like 1 or 2 moments during the day. We do it in a fun way and they make fun of me, but it's very effective and they're really honest, I think. So things like that, I'd say, really, really connecting across things that otherwise could really separate us, divide us, create resentments, confusion, distance. One of the things I keep saying to people is don't leave loving things unsaid any day right now, because there's enough stress. The stress level for all of us is not going to change anytime soon. So basically what we need to do is raise the positive affect coming into our lives and our beings. And so if you think about that for yourself, then think about that for the people around you, right? Their stress level is going to stay here. You have to help them reach a higher vibration. And we can do that for each other. We can do that remotely, and we can do that for the people who are around us immediately.
And as someone who myself studies social emotional learning, I really like to think of compassion as a skill and a
I
muscle,
agree.
just like everything
Absolutely.
else. So we have to practice compassion regularly and in small ways before we can, you know, expand it to the harder situations.
I could not possibly agree with you more. Compassion is a skill set, mindfulness is a skill set, and connecting with people in an empathic way. They are all skill sets. There are a number of great websites. If you want to build skills in these ways, Quora and Medium, these are great sites. I set my feeds in Quora and Twitter to learn from people who are engaging in really good, positive self-care and who are doing wellness and communication and relationships really well. So for me, like I have a Twitter feed and a Quora feed that are always helping me with skills building around these things. And then I'm also learning how to help the people around me build those skills.
Well, Sharon, that is all the time we have. Thank you again so much for joining us. It's been a
So much,
pleasure.
Taylor. Much love to you. Wishing everyone health and goodness. And I hope that you can raise your own vibrations and the vibrations of the people around you in ways that help us to think forward with hope and love in our hearts. Much love to you. Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to reach out to me by email or through Twitter if you'd like to continue this dialogue. And if you're a GSE student, staff, or faculty, please feel free to call me at any point and reach out. I'm happy to talk to you and support you. Love to everyone. Thank you so much, Zachary and Taylor and Chanel and the team. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks so much.